if we say scale is not a synonym of growth, okay, now let us sit and brood over it, saying, what does that mean? Because growth is obsessed with the growth of my solution. Scale is obsessed with the size of the problem. And these are two different worlds, these are two different paradigms.
I'm Raj Kumar, and you're in the Devex Book Club. Maybe you're a global development nerd like me, maybe you work at the United Nations or an NGO, or maybe you're just really excited to hear from some of the world's leading authors on the most important issues today. Either way, you're in the right place. This conversation isn't just for people who work in the sector, it's for everyone. Because global development issues affect us all, whether it's the price of gas rising because of the conflict in Ukraine, or the more extreme weather that we're experiencing due to climate change. I got into this field as a kid spending time in rural India because I had an aunt and an uncle who were authors themselves and wrote about some of the issues facing villagers in the early era of India's independence. I've now spent 2 decades as the editor-in-chief of Devex. Our reporters cover these topics every day, and I've traveled to dozens of countries around the world and met thousands of aid workers. Their stories never stop fascinating me. These are the biggest issues facing the world today, and they're not static. They're changing fast, and they're often changing because of big, bold, new ideas coming from some of the very thinkers and authors we're going to be hearing from on this podcast. As an author myself, I know how much goes into writing a book and how much expertise these authors bring. I want to tap into that. I want to talk about what's in their books, but also what's been left out, to learn more about what motivates them and to ask them about some of the biggest issues of the day. Unlike most book clubs, you'll get to know the person, not just the book. This is a chance for you to be a part of that too, sharing your questions and your insights as we join together for this, the Devex Book Club podcast. So grab a snack and a comfortable seat and get ready for our discussion. And don't worry if you haven't read the book. You're still very much welcome.
If you've spent much time in the global development space, you know that there's a lot of talk about scale. At its most basic, doing things at scale refers to finding solutions that can be replicated and implemented across different contexts. But it's also so much more. Sanjay Purohit is the chief curator at Societal Thinking and co-author of the new book, Think Scale, a curation of ideas to help you design for scale. Half meditation, half workbook, Think Scale is designed to get to the heart of what it really means to think at scale. With reflections and quotes from leaders throughout the social innovation community, the book asks readers to think about scale on a new level and to, quote, not allow it to be buried under the comfort of what is considered pragmatic. Sanjay, it's great to have you here.
It's lovely to meet you, Raj. I have obviously never met you before, so
I know. It's real. I feel like I've met you because we've been, I know of you and have read your work, and of course know of the work that you do over at Societal Platforms, and so it's really lovely to get some time together. But it really is a pleasure to get to speak with you because I think scale is one of these questions that everyone in the development space has tried to wrap their arms around. And you do something a bit interesting and unique in your book, Think Scale, which is you don't try to solve the problem. You sort of adopt what is now maybe talked about as the best practice, but rarely actually implemented. And that is to say, I'm not trying to solve a problem here. I'm just simply trying to reflect and cause you, the reader, to reflect on what is this issue of scale all about? And how might we think about it each in our own way, and therefore come away from this reading, and it's almost like a workbook approach to perhaps doing something a bit differently than you did before you read it. And I guess that maybe we can just start with a little bit about who you are and how you come to this writing, because I know of you as a social innovator who has spent many years now, decades now, thinking about new approaches to problems that the development community has tried to address for many, many years in more traditional ways, whether it's education or livelihood or health, or you're thinking in different ways than the average development leader or practitioner, I would say. And so maybe we just start with a little bit about you. Tell people who are listening, who is Sanjay Purohit? How did you come to this work and to this writing?
Thank you for that, Raj. And so I had a very conventional beginning, early days in corporate life, learning about scale, because I was fortunate to grow with a company called Infosys, which saw unprecedented scale. And heading strategy for that company, I was firsthand sitting in the cockpit while the founders were flying the planes and learning about what is this question of scale and what are the driving elements of it, and how do you even look for things that would happen many many years from now and take a long range view on scale rather than scaling through replication of what I already know. So 2016 I decided to get into this quest in a very big way. Started with the question saying everybody talks of let us scale what works, and I said maybe I could be useful if I tried a different question: what works at scale? And so, same words, but very different meaning, because something that works may not scale, something that scales may not work. So the question is, what works at scale? And that led me into this whole exploration, which I'm still on, by the way. I believe it's a 25-year exploration. I'm only on year eight, of trying to unpack this question, and not trying to answer it, but trying to stay with the question as long as I can. Because many people ask me, so what works at scale? You've been at this for so long now. Have you figured this out? And I said, well, I don't know. And I think that's the only right answer. There is no other right answer of what works at scale. Because the moment I say I don't know, I am willing to accept many thoughts, many patterns, many questions. The day I say I know what works at scale, that's the end of my query.
It does seem like you've come at this, at least initially, from that private sector experience. I think most people listening have heard of Infosys, but in case someone hasn't, it's of course now one of the world's largest IT companies, software companies, IT implementation companies. How many employees, more or less, does Infosys have? Do you
Now
have a sense now?
250,000.
250,000. I mean, it's a juggernaut of a company. And of course, you were there with Nandan Nilekani, who is also probably very well known to our audience listening and has gone on to help lead India's digital ID efforts, the Aadhaar efforts, probably the world's largest and most successful ID effort. And he's still a close collaborator of yours, and
Yes,
has a major role funding and supporting the work you do at
absolutely.
societal platforms, right? So you kind of come of this, building a private sector company where you led strategy and taking it from nothing. I mean, I think it was started with a loan for $10,000 or something, right? To
10,000 rupees.
10,000 rupees. Yeah, back in the day, there in Bangalore, where you're based, right, where you're
Yes,
sitting right
yes,
now,
yes.
into this global juggernaut. And I guess I wonder. I know you're early in this journey, and you really have this open, exploring view about it, but it does seem like doing that in business, as hard as it is in some ways much easier than doing what you're talking about now, which is addressing the inequalities in the world that exist at this dramatic level. And,
Yes.
and I guess I wonder, just kind of going back to your personal motivation, you could well have left Infosys and gone on to a similar role at a similar company, right? You could have sat on a lot of corporate boards. Why did you decide to go into this kind of work? What is it that made you think there's an opportunity here that fits for you?
I think it was driven by the quest for challenge at the very basic level, but more importantly, the question that in the end, the purpose of any institution, anything that we put together, is to ensure that we have healthy building generative societies. And so even when we were building Infosys, it was very clear that the idea was to ensure that we build an industry which is a respected industry of the country, changes the landscape. That philosophical underpinning was always there. And I have always been deeply interested and committed to dealing with challenges of climate, healthcare, education, livelihoods. And I said it's time to go in. And so initially I had to learn. So one of the things that I did in the beginning was I joined an incubator, now known as the Nudge Institute. And over the first 5 years, I worked with almost 100 or so social entrepreneurs, because they were just starting, just early, and everybody has this question about scale, and everybody has this. And I said, let's learn, let's see what happens on the ground, and why is it that everybody kind of gets foxed with this question of scale. And in that journey, like you rightly said, I could have gone on and taken a classical corporate job. I realized that probably it's a much more meaningful use of my time to take on some of these kind of challenges. In India, there's a philosophy that you should divide your life into four stages. The first stage, the first 25 years, if you're fortunate to live 100, it should be about learning and building your knowledge base. The next 25 is about building your foundation and your stability. Third 25 is about building the ecosystem, the environment, the society around you. And the fourth 25 is to be at disposal of people who want to get something from you, if at all, right? So I was entering my third 25 and said, okay, this is the time to put to bear whatever I have learned. At Infosys, before that with Tatas, I was there with Tatas for some time. And I've been very fortunate to have Nandan as a friend, guide, and mentor now for 24 years, to be able to jam with him. And initially, I started by analyzing what happened in Aadhaar. Why is it that such an infrastructure got adopted by a billion people? Or what were the underlying principles? The Unified Payments Interface Revolution of India, which today does 450 million transactions every day. Why did that happen? We started working in education. The education ecosystem of India is 1.5 million schools serving 350 million children. And we were making good headway in teacher training and teacher development. Last 12 months, we have done something like 6.5 billion learning sessions. So why? What is it that makes this happen? And that's what led me into this journey of unpacking networks, ecosystems, the role of technology, the role of civil society, governments, private sector. All of this sort of unfolded as I started this exploration, because all of us were on this quest as to, if we have to shift the equilibrium of our societies where we live in our lifetime, then we have to take this question head on, rather than make it into a I also think about scale, vis-a-vis saying I start by thinking about scale, because without that, how far will we get is the question.
It does seem like the fact that you've come at this from a very different life experience is maybe essential to the way you've approached it with a new lens. Because exactly as you say, much of this is about a mindset shift. I think that's what the book is trying to do. It's almost Socratic. It's almost, you talked about the four phases of life that are commonly thought of in India. And I think that fourth phase is often considered very spiritual in nature, right? And even the book almost feels a little bit spiritual, philosophical too. I know you're in your third phase, but it does make you think a bit about kind of very big picture existential questions.
Right.
And what are we really trying to do? And at least for me, I think there is some tension here, because on the one hand, you're saying, look, we need to come at this from a very different perspective to start with. Your organization is even called societal thinking. Right at the forefront of it is, it's a mindset. And yet, when I consider the community here at Devex, people who work at the World Bank or work in the UN or in NGOs, they have to get up every day, they go to work in their organization, and they bring a very organizational lens naturally, right? And you're really challenging that in this book and in the way you're pushing people to think differently and saying, look, you can't scale your organization ever
Right.
to meet the real needs that are there in the world. So what really are you hoping people who read the book sort of go and do differently?
I think you're absolutely right that in the early days, I discovered that first and foremost, we have to root ourselves in a set of values, because values are the founding beliefs of all our systems. And if we don't explore them, then mindsets are hard to shift. So the entire thinking was based on three important values of agency, dignity, and choice, which is how do you ensure that you leverage and restore the agency of people, because that's the most abundant resource that we as a civilization have. How do we ensure that we nurture dignity, and how do we ensure that we strengthen people to make the choices that are right for them and their planet? But at the same time, it was important to understand that to shift mindset, we have to come out with the vocabulary. And that's why when you read Think Scale, you'll realize that it has a certain vocabulary construct. That's why even in the book, if you look at the first section I wrote was what does scale mean in English, right? Because it's vocabulary. And then from there, we got into mindset shifts, like the one I started with, let's scale what works versus what works at scale. The second similar mindset shift was let's not distribute solutions, let's distribute the ability to solve. The third similar mindset shift was diversity is not a challenge, diversity is the solution. And so we started unpacking a bunch of mindsets, because when people are strongly embedded into organizations, that organization construct is a function of the organization's vocabulary and its mindset.
How do you think this looks in the real world practically, right? Because when I hear you, of course, I think about what you and Nandan Nilekani are doing in India. But there's a number of unique factors there, which, again, to the main point of your book, you're saying if you just look for what works in one place, that's not scale. You can't just add it up, replicate it 1,000 times. And so I wonder, does that same problem apply here in that you have in India, a massive country, right? So you can immediately think in terms of tens of millions, even hundreds of millions, sometimes at the state level, forget about the federal level. You have a lot of resources domestically, including a lot of domestic wealth. And there you have philanthropists like Nandan himself who can support this sort of work. And I wonder, for others who are listening in other parts of the world who might say, well, our circumstances are different. Does this really apply everywhere? Does this new approach to thinking actually work in other contexts?
That's a great question. And I had the same question in 2017, just after I had completed 1 year of structuring some of this thought. And I said, let's do this. So, over the last many years, I worked with more than 100 change leaders across 20 countries to apply these principles, this thinking, and explore, ranging from prison reforms to forest conservation to early childhood development to, I could just keep naming the sectors, fisheries, and in different countries.
Hi, I'm Kate Warren, Executive Editor at Devex. If you are listening to this podcast, you are likely working to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals. But are you subscribed to Devex Newswire? Global development can be a fast-moving, complex sector. Our team of global reporters work every day to bring you the news you need to make sense of it all. In Devex Newswire, we keep you up to date on issues ranging from climate change financing to gender equality and global health to transforming the food system, all in a fun-to-read, free newsletter delivered directly to you 5 days a week. Join the hundreds of thousands of global development professionals who receive Devex Newswire and visit devex.com/newsletters to sign up to this free newsletter today.
Is it fair to think of this as kind of a big bet approach to development? In other words, there you are with your 10 projects, with your sleeves rolled up, maybe others hear your ideas and they themselves initiate projects, and these are sort of low probability of success. But if they hit, if they work somewhere, you reach that 100 million people getting access to better nutrition or education or what have you. Is it fair to kind of think of this approach as a big bet?
I don't think so. And let me share why I don't think it's a big bet question. Because when it comes to contributing to lives of millions of people, it is not a bet. There is too much at stake here. And at least I can't convince myself to work with this idea that, it's a big shot, it's a big chance, it might work, because I don't think any of the journeys can afford to fail. I see that's why we brought in the word exponential change. The center that I had, I'm the CEO of Center for Exponential Change. And we said that scale is a frame. How you get there is through exponential change, right? That's why right after Think Scale, we wrote Think Speed, which is the second book. And the third book is Think Sustain. And the reason is because scale by itself is incomplete as a thought process if we don't think of exponential change. And so I think the bigger question is the persistence to master or to pursue geometric change, to pursue multiplication, to pursue strengthening of the ecosystem. So I don't approach it as a bet. I more approach it as an endeavor to create change that creates more change. That's the way I define exponential change. Is that it's not change that multiplies very fast. That's one way you could look at it. But essentially, it's change that creates more change. For example, if I work with my friend Harish Hande at Selco Foundation on the intersection of distributed renewable energy and healthcare, when we do that, it is not only that it changes healthcare, it creates a ripple effect and a trigger effect in multiple facets of that society. And I am looking at the fifth ripple rather than what is happening now. So it's not about big and it's not about bet. It's about creating or strengthening the society's ability to create and absorb change, because that is where the change has to be absorbed. It is not about what I can do, it is about what the people can do, what the communities can do, because that's how scale happens. Scale happens when people in the community are able to sustain that transformation over time. So a little bit probably again a different take on it, but it's not a portfolio view of things. Every journey makes its progression. Some may take 3, 5, 8 years. It doesn't matter. But once we embark on something, there is no going back.
I love the way you think about that. And I did have the impression reading the book that it really, although it has quotes from all over the world and leaders who are from everywhere, it really is not a Western approach to thinking about these issues. You can tell it comes from India. You can tell it comes from Asia, right? It's got a different philosophy behind it. And you're right, the big bet idea, it is in some ways sort of colonial. It is sort of, hey, we have the answer somewhere. And those we tend to be people with resources and power and maybe with all of the very best intentions, but to say, we're going to place a bet, a wager in a sense. And I understand your rejection of even that language, that vocabulary, to use your earlier word, because in itself, it suggests both that you're doing something for someone else and that these issues are so trivial you can gamble on them. And so I appreciate the way you're thinking about it. It really does seem like a very different starting point at which to try to think of these challenges.
Yeah, because I think in the end, our mindset matters as well. And to take on something like this, one of the things that we've been working on is what kind of self-efficacy is required to take something like this. Because Albert Bandura when he worked on the aspect of self efficacy, which is belief in one's own capabilities to do this. And I think that is what I love to focus on. It's not about me making a bet on you, it's about your self efficacy to take on something like this. My job is to ensure whatever is possible to bring together, great, but the real power is in your self efficacy, right? um, and hence that's why if you look at Think Scale the book, it is written more as questions to myself rather than prescriptions to you. They are more written as, like, if we say scale is not a synonym of growth, okay, now let us sit and brood over it, saying what does that mean? Because growth is obsessed with the growth of my solution, scale is obsessed with the size of the problem. And these are two different worlds, these are two different paradigms. Now I have to explore it as a reader of the book as to how do I process this and what is my self efficacy to take on which end of the spectrum. I have transformed 20,000 schools and I'm going to transform 50,000 more. Fantastic. It's growing, but it's an ecosystem of 1.5 million schools. Let's talk about scaling.
I
And
mean,
that's going
most of the development ecosystem is based in the West, right? If you think of the biggest foundations in the world, the biggest bilateral donors, they tend to be in the West, and I guess they have a very different approach. And what would you want them, if you imagine the president of a major global foundation reading this? What would you want them to come away and sort of think about doing differently than the way that they operate today? Because many of them, I think, if pressed, would say, "Of course, we care about scale. Of course, we're trying to address scale." But really, I think you're challenging the very definition of what they're doing and saying, maybe you're not actually. You might think you are, but you're not actually. So, what would you want them to do?
Firstly, I think that itself is changing. Even the Center for Exponential Change that we created, it's a co-creation between Skoll Foundation, New Profit, Institute of Asia, and the Nilekani Philanthropies. So I think I would be encouraged by the fact that there are some very good thought processes happening there. And in this construct, we created a concept called the paradigm grants, and we said it's important to allocate resources to thinking, uh, to create that space, to create the oxygen, not to design. The tradition of design grants has been around for a long time. But I'm saying just to step back and explore the boundaries of our imagination and what are we trying to do. Because to make a leap from growth to scale is changing the boundary of the work that we are doing. And now we are seeing that coming together. So what I would like to see more of is some of the best thinkers, the best minds, some of the most experienced minds who have the highest level of proximity to the ground, who have seen the issues firsthand. Is it behooves us as a philanthropic ecosystem to provide that lift to saying, think differently, right? Einstein had once said that our execution is a subset of our imagination. And I think I would really look forward to all the resource pools to dedicate some portion of their resources to reimagining in some thoughtful way, not reimagining as in just kind of doing scenario planning, and that has been done a lot, but something that allows for people to challenge the boundaries of, rather than in the one of the biggest risks I see in my life most of the time is that let's be pragmatic is a very dangerous line, because many a times let's be pragmatic limits our potential to what we could actually do. So I hope that I use this phrase that we have to build a lot of unreasonable restless pioneers. And I think all the large organizations who have the resources should groom unreasonable restless pioneers rather than let's do something pragmatic, which I'm not saying should not be done, but at least some portfolio, maybe 20%. 10%, to be unreasonable, to be restless, to test the boundary of the work we're doing would be a great idea.
Are you looking for the inside story on what's happening at organisations like the World Bank, USAID or the Gates Foundation? Then you need to be reading Devex Pro. I'm Jessica Abrahams and I'm the editor of Devex Pro. Pro is Devex's premium news subscription, where our expert reporters and analysts take you beyond the headlines, deep into the trends and institutions shaping the $200 billion aid industry. As well as all our news, you'll get access to conversations with global development leaders, resources to help you grow in your career, and a subscriber-only newsletter full of insider news and tidbits. See for yourself by getting a free trial today at devex.com/pro.
Yeah, it's fascinating because at least my impression is that philanthropies often talk about their ability to take risk, right? This is usually the money of an individual or the money of a family. And they say one thing that makes us unique is we can take big risk. But in the end, they end up culturally becoming closer to a pragmatic way of addressing these issues, as you describe, than a true risk-taking approach. And it may just be the bureaucratic culture inside philanthropies. It may be a desire to make sure no money gets wasted, knowing how hard it was to earn it. I don't know where it comes from exactly, but there's more talk about risk-taking, in my impression, than there is actual risk-taking. And it sounds like you're suggesting, we need to shift that paradigm somewhat.
Yeah, I think it comes from a place where knowing how big is the problem and how limited is our resource, and hence the gravity towards let's make the best use of it. So I would be reasonable with everybody who's kind of challenged with this question, that it's coming from this place of anxiety, that if the world is projected to need many trillions of dollars to fix the sustainable goals by 2030, I only have a few million. Where do I want to put it? And that brings you back to let's make the difference that I can make. And I don't think that's unreasonable. But I think what would be very interesting is to deal with a portfolio of some reasonable work and a bit of unreasonable work. In my work on scale, one of the questions that I ponder with is, most of the times we try to find out what is scarce, like good teachers are scarce, great healthcare professionals are scarce, great government services are scarce, and so on. And then we talk about how do you fight that scarcity. And I have always tried to experiment with this idea that whatever is scarce, we should make it irrelevant. And whatever is abundant, we should make it effective. And that is a different model of scaling. Because if we put more and more technical, technocratic, or structured minds to what is scarce, we actually make it more scarce. Because we say we don't have good teachers, I'll create the fantastic teacher and show you this is how to create it. But then that fantastic teacher is even further away from reality. Whereas if we see that, then we should be able to then strip it down and bring it back to meet the people where they are and then take them towards that journey. That requires risk capital. That requires taking chances that sometimes it may work, sometimes it may not work. And I think that part of the portfolio should be a part of everyone's mindset, saying there are some places where the risk is not that it may not work. The risk is that if we do nothing, what are the consequences? That also is a risk, right? It's not only the risk of my investment working or not working, but the risk of that segment of the society progressing or not progressing. Which risk are we indexing towards?
Maybe you can talk a little bit about the example of education in India, because it's one you're very deeply involved in.
Yes.
And I know, one of the ways you tried to approach it was from this societal platforms idea, right? Can we use digital infrastructure to build a single platform that can support the children most in need in the country? And I think you tried to figure out sort of what's the key question we can ask that would help us design the right kind of approach. And you ended up with QR codes and textbooks.
Mm.
I mean, tell us a little bit about that journey that led you to QR codes and textbooks, and then what have you learned from that so far in terms of what's working and what's not, and the ability to scale that solution.
So at the Xtep Foundation, where I began this entire journey, which is the foundation of Rohini and Nandan Nilekani, Shankar Marwada, who's the CEO, Pramod, who's the chief architect, myself, a whole bunch of us, always were on this quest of what is it that is minimal but transformative to their daily habits of the system. So, what is a daily habit? A daily habit is a teacher comes in the class, opens a textbook, and starts reading, or asks some child to read, or writes on the board what is written in the textbook and asks everybody else to read, and very common practice in education systems. And we said, can we intercept that habit? And we said, okay, let's intercept that habit by putting a QR code in the textbook. And everybody thought, oh, what's a big idea? Who wants to put a QR code in a textbook? But it's a very complex problem. This is a country where we print almost close to 2 billion textbooks every year through 140 plus publishers. It is not a just put a QR code in a textbook. Multiple state syllables, languages, all sorts of things. So the genius of Pramod was to go back and design a technological backbone which essentially could uh, take that QR code and lead it to an address rather than a fixed object, which means our ability to continuously refresh, modify, modulate. And we were able to create the curiosity. Now you come in the classroom, you open the textbook and you see a QR code and say, what is this? Right? And let's scan and see what happens. And that creates this ripple or a trigger or a domino effect. But more importantly, you start getting visibility into an absolutely opaque education system. Now you know that today triangles are being taught in this part of the country, or that part of the country spending more time on verbs and nouns in some grammar lesson. And so what happened with this entire transformation, which sounded like a very simple idea, saying, oh, you're putting QR codes and people are scanning and reading content. But actually, it was the other way around. It was like the GPS. It was telling us the state of the movement of the education system and what is happening and where should we reinforce it and where do we need more training and where do we ensure that the content is not appropriate and where are the struggles and why is somebody going slow and why is somebody going fast and what are the innovations happening. So that whole idea that something minimalistic at scale is way more powerful than a monolith in a limited amount of area, that proves the point. So yeah, so it's been another education related project or related journey that we took on, was how do you develop leaders in the education system. So Indian education system is run by 4.5 million leaders. I have not seen of any leadership development program that there are 4.5 million leaders. And so we said, obviously, if we set up a leadership institute, we won't get done in 10,000 years because this is some way too large. One day I walked into the classroom of a school principal, and behind his chair was a poster which says, do one thing every day that scares you. So I asked him, why do you have this? Why have you put up this poster? He said, if I just did what the system told me, if I just did what policies told me, if I just did what manuals and my teacher training told me, these children have no future. So I have to understand they are first generation learners. They come from migrant labor communities. They don't have understanding of English. They hardly have nutrition at home. They have early childhood development deficiencies. And I have to do things every day, which is not in my rule book. And if I do that, it is scary because somebody will ask me, why are you doing this? Who gave you the permission to do this? Where did you find the money? So I have decided that every day I'll do one small scary thing. And I thought that's interesting. What if 4.5 million people did one scary thing every day? Little bit. And that's what led to a whole nationwide micro improvement program. So leadership development through the courage to exercise your agency within the influence and the infrastructure and the resources that you have. It thaws you, it unlocks your ability to change, which you lost because you believe, oh, I don't think. And that's why in the book you will find there's a chapter called agency fuel scale and vice versa, right? Because agency really drives scale, and scale drives agency. It's a virtuous cycle.
It seems like you're coming at these challenges with the perspective that what we're lacking in mostly is ideas as opposed to resources. And I think the dominant theory among people who work in global development is that no, we're more constrained by money, right? We're more constrained by finances. If only rich countries would spend more in bilateral aid, if only the World Bank were 3 times bigger, if only philanthropists did much more, we could get to solving these problems more quickly. Maybe we can get to scale. And it sounds like you're coming at this from a different perspective. You're saying actually it's not that we're abundant in some ways. It's the problem is the idea, the perspective. Is that fair? Is that how you see things?
Yes, and the reason is because the question is, what is the resource for scale? Because the resource for innovation could be very different from resource for scale, could be very different from resource for sustainability. And I believe that the resource for scale is the agency of people. Um, and the role of financial resources, etc., is to mobilize, is to coordinate, is to orchestrate, is to facilitate the unlocking of agency in the right direction, in a thoughtful manner. And hence, because that is abundant, um, every human on this planet actually has agency. They may have lost it because of the system, circumstances, oppression, issues, challenges, inequities, injustice. So it's not an easy question. It's a very hard question to realize what is the fuel, but we bank on agency, dignity, and people's ability to make choices as an important destination to drive that transformation. That's how movements have happened. If you go back in history and you look at very large scale movements, whether they were anti-slavery movements or whether they were large scale freedom struggles and so on and so forth, the fundamental resource at scale was the agency of people. Then, of course, we need millions of dollars and thousands of bright people to actually heave ho and sort of put the system into its place. I always have this question. Systems change is a conversation that we have all the time, and I say I think we need change systems, uh, right? And so that systems are capable of changing rather than me going and changing the system.
We're talking at a time when your country, India, is having elections. Here in the US, there are elections. 60% of the world is going to vote or live in countries that will have democratic elections this year of some kind. And I imagine some people listening to this might say, look, rather than trying to build some new societal platform, why not just put your funding into advocacy, right? The best agency of people is the vote. And so much of the world, has the vote because of so many struggles that have gotten us to this point. Why not focus on that alone and essentially see government as the solution to scaling problems or addressing problems at scale? Because that's what government's job is, essentially. How do you think about sort of where government sits here and the role of advocacy and supporting the work of people-led movements in advocacy within government as opposed to kind of doing something alongside it?
One way we think about this is that, firstly, scale is only feasible when government, civil society, private sector, all institutions come together. They may come together at different points in time, play different roles, but like in a forest, every species counts. Uh, this is not about farming. This is about societies are built like forests and not streamlined like farms. And in a farm, anything that is not wheat or that is not rice is weed, but in a forest, there is no weed. Everything is a part of the ecosystem. And so the question that we grapple with it is that to build a healthy society, government, civil society, private sector, communities, individuals, all actors have to play different roles. If you go back in evolution of institutional structures, then society created governments for a certain purpose. But over time, society became the subject of the government. Society created markets for a certain purpose. After some time, that society became consumers in the market, right? So there's a role reversal in that sense that has happened over time. And I think great government leaders are realizing that I think it is not that government is only responsible for solving problems at scale. So let us focus only on one dimension and expect them to solve it. Government's role is to play its own question of building infrastructure, creating the enabling conditions, ensuring there is rule of law, ensuring that some of the historically marginalized populations are protected. But it's not that we can say that okay, now that we have done this, it's somebody again, that's externalizing, and that's loss of agency if we say that. So in that sense comes back to that question of saying that if you truly want a transformation at scale, then it's very important for government to play the role, but then civil society has to play its role and community has to play its role. We cannot just say okay, let's all put our heads together, select the right people, because I don't think, like, it comes back to the same question saying, do you think that right people knows what works at scale? And the answer is no, because no one knows. um, and so it's very important to be thoughtful about the roles that are best played by different actors in the ecosystem and not expect one actor to play the role they are not good at, or to play all the roles. But the moment we believe that businesses are going to solve the society's problem at scale, now we are loading a responsibility. Or we think the government will drive very high speed innovation, then we're expecting a different role from them. Or we expect that civil society actors will suddenly go and transform an entire population of 1 billion people at scale. So we are now probably mixing up our expectations. So we have to be careful with that.
Just taking your metaphor of the ecosystem a little further, one of the big movements now or big ideas in development is localization. And, you could say, well, even if you don't know what the right answers are, no one knows the right answer to scale. At a minimum, you need the infrastructure of lots of local organizations close to the communities that are dealing with problems. They need to have some basic resources and abilities. And so there's a big movement to say, let's move funding, philanthropic funding, government aid funding closer to the communities and have more of a locally led approach to development. It sounds like that concept is maybe at least something you would be sympathetic to, even if it's not really the same exactly as what you're talking about. But I'm curious to get your take on this idea that's kind of sweeping the development landscape to some degree today of localization. How do you feel about it?
Yeah, I think one thing is emerging more and more for us, that thinking and building responsive networks um, of people is the right way to face the challenge of scale. But it's not one mega network. It's a network of many networks. Like Duncan Watts had done this entire work on small worlds. So the question is, we're all made of small worlds. You have your small world, I have my small world. And people in villages have their own small world, communities have their small world. And many a times the small worlds are more capable of solving their challenges than somebody who's coming from a different small world is trying to solve it in this small world, right? So going back to the question of agency, I totally agree. But I think one difference, if we think about redirecting resources to all these small worlds, then we'll have the same scarcity question, because there are millions of small worlds. And again, we'll get into this situation saying, let's solve it for three small worlds and then port this solution to another 200,000 small worlds. And so we have to be very careful that when we move our resources to find an answer in a small world, what do you do after that? Do you step back and unbundle, reorganize, and create infrastructure that can power up many, many small worlds? Or then once you have worked in one small world, you look for the next one. And nothing wrong with it, but it should not be mixed with the aspiration of scale, because small world by small world, we will have the same problem of we need a few $1 trillion to do SDGs by 2030. Or else we'll have this question of saying, I solved it in 3 villages. It should work in 800,000 villages. But I don't know. I am not confident, or at least I have not seen yet that happening. So, so I think I am for, absolutely for going close to communities, figuring out what works. But my question always is, what after that, right? What do you do with it? And I think what we do with it is we have to come back and reorganize ourselves for a scalable response.
Well, I'm not surprised that you, at the end of that thinking, landed another question, because that is very much in the spirit of the approach you're taking and of this book, which certainly, as you can tell from this conversation, got me thinking. And I recommend to everyone who's listening to this to read it, because I think it will get you thinking too. It's not a book that you might expect, in the sense it's not a big, long narrative argument. It's instead these small philosophical provocations, these questions, these quotes that really push people to think in a different way. And it's been such a joy and a pleasure to be part of your small world, at least briefly here today, Sanjay, to get to meet you and talk to you and to think a little bit in the way that you think, because I think it's a provocative set of ideas that you're presenting to our community. So thank you for the conversation, and thank you for the book.
Thank you so much, Raj. It's a privilege to be here, and the quest is on. And so I look forward to receiving more prompts from our community, our friends, our families, who are, all of us are on a quest. So the more we ask questions, the higher is the probability of landing at a better answer.
Sanjay Purohit is the chief curator at Societal Thinking and co-author of Think Scale, a curation of ideas to help you design for scale. You can follow him on social media at Sanjay Purohit M.
Thank you all for joining. If you like the podcast, please share with your friends and give us 5 stars. And we really do want to hear from you. Please leave your thoughts in the comments or send me a message on Twitter at Raj_Devex. To learn what we're reading next, make suggestions for future guests, or submit questions for authors, be sure to sign up for our Devex Book Club mailing list, which you can find in the description of the show wherever you're listening to this. If you care about global development issues and you want the latest news, don't forget to subscribe to the Devex Newswire at the link in the comments, where you'll get the day's top global development breaking news, analysis, and opinion, as well as the date of the next book club. Until then, do good out there, and thanks for joining.